My next guest, Dennis Shaul, is the former top aide to Congressman Barney Frank, who co-authored the Dodd-Frank bill. He now heads the Community Financial Services Association of America, which represents small-dollar lenders. Good to see you, Dennis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maria. Good to be here.
Did Dodd-Frank go far enough?
I think it's hard to say because we're not far enough along, but I am dubious about breaking up the big banks. I think if you go back and look at NAFTA and beyond, what you see is a growth in banking that I think resembles what's happening internationally. And therefore, before we go breaking up the banks, which would be a one-time act, it's not like you could reverse it, we better look at the causes for the growth of the large banks. And I think that research has yet to be done in many ways. In other words, Kashkari is summoning us to look at the consequences of 2008. I think we'd be better off going back further than that and assessing why these banks grew the way they did.
Because the truth is when you look at America today, whether it's a small business or a large business, companies need, in many cases, complex financing.
Yes.
So a large bank is the only institution out there to be able to help with certain lending for some of America's largest companies.
Right. The world changed dramatically in the 90s in terms of trade, and we're committed to it. That brings with it a number of issues that we didn't face 20 years ago. One of them, I think, is bank growth, and you have to remember that we are, in fact, we have less large banks as that's in the top 10 than we did a while ago. So I think what the dramatic step here is certainly not the first step that should be taken. And beyond that, there is a question of whether or not it really serves the interests of the United States to be doing that.
Dennis, do you think that he gives the heads up to Janet Yellen before he comes out and makes a speech like that?
I've got to believe he did.
Yeah, so what do you think she thinks about that? She thinks it's a good idea?
I am dubious that she thinks that. Oh, this is just simply a personal opinion, but my guess is that most economists are for interim steps before you reach the point where you're talking about breaking up the big banks. And as with so many other things, the unforeseen consequences of taking that action could be fairly dramatic.
Even like a Dan Tarullo, you think agrees with that?
I'm not sure you could go that far. Yeah.
What you say is so reasonable. Like, if you're going to look at this, it's a one-time thing. You need to go back into the 90s at least to assess why the banks are as big as they are. Reasonable, but how many people you think who are elected officials in this country really understand the banking system?
Well, it's less of a percentage than we would like, and implied in your question is the idea that if it's reasonable, it may have a hard time getting anywhere.
Yeah, and it doesn't win votes. Yeah. It has to be unreasonable.
That's my point. Populism and policy are now in the same equation, Dennis. And so how do we get that out of the equation and focus on what's right versus what's left and right?
Well, realistically, I don't think that is going to happen until after we have gone through this election cycle, for sure, because we are seeing a wave of populism that we haven't seen in a presidential year for a very long time, if ever. But you're absolutely right. I think it begins with a better attempt to educate people as to underlying economic principles. I mean, that's a long-term solution, obviously, but I think you're absolutely right that policy and populism are in a collision course right now, and it's in our best interest to avert that collision.
By the way, I don't think J.P. Morgan would have been able to bail out the government and America back in 2008 by acquiring Bear Stearns and acquiring all that it was able to acquire if it wasn't really big.
I would agree with that. I also think that you have to recognize that there is a particularly public function to banking in general, and it is in a very different category than, say, just corporations that are listed on the stock market and so forth. So all of that being true, I think you want to be very careful in regulating them. And certainly starting with the proposition that we ought to break up the banks is not where the beginning step is.
Dennis, good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your insights. Dennis Shaul there. Don't miss